All right, and welcome back to the next video in our Pokemon series. Third overall, but second in the evaluating Pokemon section. Today we're going to be focusing on evaluating your actual Pokemon itself. So what do we look at when we're doing that? Now you might be asking, in the last video we went over some supporters and item cards, but we didn't go over stadiums or Pokemon tools. The reason for that is because those tend to be more specific to the matchups that you're expecting, so they're kind of meta dependent. So I didn't really want to go into those until we're actually discussing more advanced decks and things like that. For somebody who's beginning and you don't know what you're going to be facing, it really isn't that useful at this time. That being said, we're going to move on to evaluating the actual Pokemon itself. Evaluating Pokemon is very similar to evaluating trainers like we did in the last video. Before we go into more detail on that, what we need to do though is understand the actual Pokemon card itself and what kind of information is available on that so that we can know what we're going to be using to evaluate the cards. So this is the current design for cards in June of 2026. I don't know if they'll change in the future, but they have changed since the past. So the cards you might be looking at in front of you might be different as far as layout goes. So when we're looking at the upper left here, you have your evolution. So is it a basic, a stage 1, or a stage 2? And then it also tells you what it evolves from. So this is Dracloak, which is a stage 1. It evolves from Dreepy. And then in the upper right corner, you have your HP. In the middle here, you have an ability, if it's applicable. Not all Pokemon have abilities. And then underneath that, you have attacks. And then in little parts here, on the bottom here, you have your weakness, resistance, and then the retreat cost. And then if there was a rule box, if that's applicable, and I'll show you, yeah, like a V rule here, when your Pokemon V is knocked out, your opponent may take 2 prize cards. That's a little rule box there. So this information will help you determine the type and rate for the cards. So now we'll go into the 4 things that I used last time for trainers. Is the same criteria I use for evaluating Pokemon. There's just a few more kind of items that we're looking at here. So again, to repeat, that's type, consistency, rate of return, and then disadvantages / special cases. Type. So type actually refers to a couple things in Pokemon. It can refer to the actual stage of evolution it is. It can refer to the actual typing of the Pokemon, like whether it's a dragon type, grass type, fire type, things like that, or also the types of energies attached to it. So those are all important to know when you're trying to build your deck. For specific cases, the evolution is important because you kind of need to know what kind of cards you're going to require, because in order to evolve a Pokemon, you need to have the different steps of evolution. So you need the basic type, and then you need the stage 1, and then you need the stage 2 if you're going to have a stage 2. You can't go from a basic to a stage 2 unless you have special cards like rare candy. So in order to be able to evolve your Pokemon, if you want to use a stage 2 Pokemon, you have to have the previous evolutions. And then on top of that, the actual typing is important because the way it works in Pokemon, it's like rock, paper, scissors. Different Pokemon have a weakness to other Pokemon. So fire types, for instance, are generally weak to water types. Grass types are generally weak to fire types. And this is more for when you are going more advanced and looking at the meta. So for instance, if you know that one of the most powerful decks in the meta is a fire type Pokemon, you might not want to build a deck around a grass type Pokemon. You're just going to have bad matchups if you do it that way. But again, that's more out of the scope of this video. So we're just going to focus on kind of the basics here. Consistency. This is basically the same as the last episode, and this is about how consistently you can pull off the effect of a Pokemon. So a good example of that is Mega Kangaskhan EX, who has rapid fire combo for his attack. It can do 200 plus damage, but you have to flip a coin until you get tails. This attack does 50 more damage for each heads. So it's nice because you can maximize it and you can get more. So the floor is 200, but that's not consistent. So I prefer cards generally that have more consistent output, although that's not bad. That's pretty good. Just like I said in the trainers video, I'm not a fan of coin flips. Let's move on to rate. So there's a lot of stuff that you need to evaluate when you're thinking about rate. The first thing I generally look at are HP. So here's a couple different types of Pokemon here with wildly varying HPs. So We have Latias at 210, Mega Kangaskhan EX at 300, Articuno at 120, and Tatsugiri at 70. So they all have different hit points. That means that they can take different damage based on that. So that's important to know, but it's also the evolution. Like I said, we have basic Pokemon. These are all basic Pokemon here. And then we have Dracloak, who is a stage 1 Pokemon. And then you have Dragapult, who is a stage 2 Pokemon. These evolutions are important to know because you're going to need to know what previous evolutions you're going to have in your deck to be able to use these cards or put them on the board. All right, so that's evolution and HP. And then other things I look at are abilities. I always prioritize Pokemon with abilities over Pokemon that don't. So abilities give you an effect that doesn't require any kind of energy cost. So there's different kinds of abilities. Some of them, like Latias EX, whose Skyliner ability says your basic Pokemon in play have no retreat cost. So this is like a static ability. This is an ability that as long as it's in play, it's always active. And then you have something like Lumineon V here, which is kind of an enters the battlefield or comes into play effect. And this one says, when you play this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench during your turn, you may search your deck for a supporter card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So that's a good ability because it allows you to basically tutor a supporter card anytime you put that on the bench. One of my favorite enter the battlefield abilities is actually Hariyama. And it says, once during your turn, when you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, you may use this ability. Switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon into the active spot. So it allows you to do a boss's orders or a gust effect when you play this. Again, it's cool because boss's orders is a supporter card. You can only play one per turn, but maybe you don't want to use the supporter card because you want to do another supporter. When you have Hariyama, you can boss another Pokemon up and then still use like Lily's Determination. So you still have the ability to do another supporter in that turn. So that's one of the benefits of using abilities on a Pokemon. And then lastly, there are activated abilities. So that would be like Dracloak here with Recon Directive. Once during your turn, you may look at the top 2 cards of your deck and put one of them into your hand, put the other card on the bottom of your deck. So basically what this does is at any point in your turn, you can draw the top 2 cards of your deck, pick one, put it into your hand, and put the other one on the bottom of your library. So even in fridge examples, in most cases, I want a Pokemon that has an ability over one that doesn't, just because it can affect the game a certain kind of way. It's almost like having a supporter, except that supporters you can only do once per turn. For most of these abilities, you can do them whenever you're playing the Pokemon, if it's a come into play ability, or you can do it at least once per turn. Now, some of them do have restrictions, so you do want to be aware of that. Like some say that you can only use one of this kind of ability once on your turn, so you can't just keep like spamming it with multiple different Pokemon. But something like Dracloak, if you have 2 Dracloaks in play, you can Recon Directive off one, and then right after that, you can Recon Directive again off the other one. So that's super helpful to be able to dig through your library. So now that we've covered abilities, now we're going to move on to attacks. The first thing you have to remember about attacks is that you can only attack once per turn. So when you're talking about sequencing on your turn, you're going to want to do all of your abilities, all of your trainers, so your supporters, your item cards, your stadiums, your Pokemon tools, and then putting other Pokemon on the bench. You want to do all those before you do your attack, because once you attack, your turn ends. So when we look at attack, first thing you're going to look at is really just the efficiency of the attack. So for the rate of the attack, you're going to look at how much does it cost versus how much damage does it do. Obviously, what you're going to be looking for is the most amount of damage for the least amount of energy required. And then on top of that, you're going to be looking at if there are any other effects associated with the attacks. So there's vanilla attacks, which are perfectly fine, but then there's also attacks that have abilities. So those are all kind of different factors you're going to be looking at here. So we're going to take a look at specifically Dragapult EX. So Dragapult has a primary attack that is the Jet Headbutt for 70 for 1 colorless. It's not a bad attack. Can get rid of a lot of other smaller Pokemon, but its secondary attack is where it really shines. It is Phantom Dive. So for 1 fire and 1 psychic energy, you can do 200 damage to the opposing Pokemon in the active spot. But in addition to that, it also has the ability to put 6 damage counters on your opponent's bench Pokemon in any way you like. So you can spread some damage around. I know it's a little bit confusing. We've been talking about damage, but this one talks about damage counters. So 1 damage counter is equal to 10 damage. So 6 damage counters equals 60. So you're basically spreading 60 damage to other Pokemon on their bench. So that's cool. You're doing 200 plus 60 more spread out amongst the bench Pokemon. That's a pretty powerful ability. It doesn't let you necessarily one-shot some of the bigger Pokemon, but it will allow you to start doing incremental damage. So even if you do some damage to their active and then some damage to their others, if they have to switch their Pokemons, so one other Pokemon to the active spot, there's already damage on that. So it brings them closer to getting knocked out. So those are things that you're going to want to think about when you're planning your attacks and your sequencing. On the other end of the spectrum, you have something like Bidoof, which only has 30 HP, so very easy to knock out. But it has the ability Itchy Pollen. Itchy Pollen doesn't require any energy, so it's a free attack. It only does 10 damage, but it has the ability during your opponent's next turn, they can't play any item cards from their hand. So it's a control card. Also really, really good because in the last video we discussed how important being able to play a lot of items are because they're effects that you can do multiples of in a turn. So if you lock out a person from playing any items at all on their next turn, that can be pretty devastating to their strategy and can allow you to stabilize or get ahead. Those are examples of different kinds of attacks that you're kind of thinking about, you're kind of considering when you are thinking about the rate. One of the things I didn't touch upon very much is when you're talking about evolutions. So you have a basic, a stage 1, and a stage 2. One of the things I like to think about or I like to consider is how powerful the stage 2 is. Obviously for something like Dragapult, stage 2 is very, very powerful. But what helps it is the fact that the stage 1 also has a very powerful ability. So stage 1 has the Recon Directive ability. I try to prioritize Pokemon lines. Each Pokemon line, or at least 2 of the Pokemon lines, have special abilities or special attacks. That makes it just much more powerful when you're considering power level for your deck building. If your first 2 stages, the basic and the stage 1, are kind of vanilla and they're weak attacks, then your stage 2 better be game ending. It better be like one-hit kills or something like that, because you're putting yourself in a vulnerable predicament when your other 2 stages, have way less HP, so they're easily knocked out, and you may not ever get to your stage 2. If you can somehow see where the stage 1 or the basic have their own abilities, then it kind of makes it worthwhile to be able to run that stage 2. So that's another thing to think about. All right, so now we're going to go into disadvantages and special cases. So very similar to the trainer's cards, there's going to be abilities or attacks on your Pokemon that come with a trade-off. Because they're so powerful, maybe you have to discard cards, maybe you have to return energy back to your hand from that Pokemon, maybe you have to discard energy cards to your discard pile. Or maybe it prevents you from attacking again the next turn. Maybe you can't use that attack again the next turn. So there's different kinds of abilities that come with disadvantages, usually because it's a trade-off for the amount of power that they have. So those are things to kind of consider when you are picking the cards that you're going to pick. Again, there's going to be some instances like discarding from your hand to the discard pile where you can turn that into an advantage. So maybe you need to get energies into the discard pile so that you can accelerate them onto your Pokemon. Or maybe you're going to be thinking about doing a lot of recursion. So that's where cards like Night Stretcher, Special Rod, Ordinary Rod, things like that allow you to pull cards from your discard pile back up. Again, just some things to factor in. You have to factor in the cost, including the disadvantages or the special cases, and also what you're getting out of it, and if that's going to be worth it for you or if you can build around it. If you have cards that really require you to not be able to attack the next turn or use that same attack the next turn, then maybe you need more switching abilities so that you can switch your cards around and put something else in the active so you can still attack the next turn. That also brings us into the next part here, which is retreat costs. One thing that really separates Pokemon from Magic is that in Magic you have your creatures kind of available at all times, except for when they're summoned, so they have summoning sickness, so you can't attack unless they have haste. In Pokemon, you always have one active and then the rest on your bench. There might be a situation where maybe your active Pokemon has taken damage, maybe your active Pokemon has a special condition, which we'll get into when we get to gameplay, but maybe you want to move that active Pokemon to your bench. Unless you have a card like Switch, which allows you to switch your Pokemon like that, you're going to need to do what's called a retreat. On the Pokemon itself, there's going to be different retreat costs. For instance, Dragapult has a retreat cost of 1 colorless, or 1, because it's always colorless. But something like Badoo has no retreat cost. So you can retreat at any time during your turn before you attack. And then you have something like Mega Kangaskhan, who has a retreat cost of 3. So that's a lot. So it requires you to have 3 on it before you can retract it. What does retreat cost mean? It means you're discarding that energy to your discard pile. So you're losing the energy when you're retreating. So that's not ideal at all. Obviously, if you want it, you can avoid it, you're going to want to avoid it. So you're going to want items like Switch so you can switch the places without having to pay the retreat cost. And then lastly, what you want to think about is the rule box. This is more for actual gameplay and when you're planning out your strategies. But the rule box is important because the rule box basically tells you how many prize cards the opponent can collect if they knock out that Pokemon. Pokemon without rule boxes, that's 1 prize card. So Badoo is just 1 prize card. So if Badoo gets knocked out, your opponent gets 1 prize card. And then Dragapult EX is 2 prizers. So when your Pokemon EX is knocked out, your opponent takes 2 prize cards. So that's 1/3 of your opponent's prize cards. That brings them closer to winning. And then on top of that, we've got Mega Kangaskhan. So the Mega Pokemon are 3 prize Pokemon. The Mega Pokemon and also the Tag Team GX Pokemons are 3 prize Pokemons. So if these get knocked out, your opponent takes 3 prize cards. So that's half of what they need to win. So that's another thing that you kind of have to factor in when you're deck building, is if you're filling up your deck with a bunch of Mega EXs or Tag Team GXs that are 3 prize cards, they just have to knock out 2 of those to be able to win. So something to consider. Some people will build decks without any EX Pokemon at all. So they're all single prize Pokemon. That's a single prize deck. That makes it harder for somebody to win because there's no shortcuts. So that's another thing to factor in when you're building a deck, is how many of these fancy evolutions and EXs and GXs you're going to be using, because that factors into the strategy the opponent has when they're prizing or thinking about how to prize, how to win. All right, so that was a lot of information, but we'll be wrapping up the video here. I hope that this was a good introduction into how to evaluate your Pokemon, and it gets you thinking differently about your Pokemon when you're trying to build your decks. In the next few episodes, we're going to be more going into the actual deck building process itself, kind of thinking about, what ratio of cards we're going to be putting in there, and then we'll be moving into gameplay. All right, so if you like this video, please hit that like button, hit subscribe, and hit that notification bell to get notified of new videos on our channel. And like I said, we're going to be doing different kinds of things on this channel now, so I do hope you like this, and I do hope you go along for the ride, because we'll be exploring different kinds of concepts. And as always, no matter where you find yourself on this journey, please take a moment, however brief, to take a closer look at life. Bye for now.